Thanks everyone for joining our session, for your interests in prospects of Russian economy. And we already had two big panel discussions on forecasts of development. And the first of them with Mr. Silanov and Mr. Kudrin involved, dedicated to national projects and achievement of our national development goals, about the risks and constraints our government sees about it. And our previous session, where, as I understand, many people attended with involvement of Minister of Economic Development, Maxim Oreshkin, Ksenia Udayeva, and foreign colleagues about the problems of world economy and development programs. So our session is a logic continuation of the topic, and we will focus in a more detail at a technical level and at the level of numbers and statistics of what's the vision for Russia's economy development and our own Russian Academy of National Economy and Public Administration, and also our research centers. And of course, the problem of 2019 is one of the most important. As you probably know, most of the forecasts, including official forecasts from the Ministry of Economic Development and the Central Bank, so the expectation for 2019, although the forecasts are based on a favorable economic development scenario, all the forecasts suggest a slowdown in Russian economy in the current year as compared to 2018, and later on from 2020 the positive forecasts which are positive for development of Russia economy indicate a certain growth which might be fast or slow. So this is what's the most exciting. So if we will slow down later this year, 2019. So what are the measures to be taken to achieve an economic growth? And of course, we suggest not to just discuss some numbers about GDP, inflation, and the national currency exchange rate, but of course to achieve the national development goals as said by the President of the Russian Federation, becoming national economy number 5, of whether we will achieve levels of the countries which are ahead of us. So we should rather focus on whether our economic rates are sustainable, whether Russia will be able to achieve the 5th position and keep it for a number of years. Also, in our first session dedicated to national projects, so we discussed the external conditions for economy development, because despite that in recent years Russia and Russian economy was subject to substantial external pressure in form of the sanction and tensions in relations with Russian companies and skepticism on the side of foreign investors, Russia is still part of the global economy. It is integrated into the global economy, and on the one hand it depends on the processes going on in the global economy and the world growth rates, but also these conditions are certain constraints which also entail a potential for our growth. So let me introduce our panelists. So the keynote speaker from RANEPA will be head of Structural Research Laboratory in RANEPA, Alexey, Vedev, and we also have Gabriel, the head of representative office of the International Moderator Fund in the Russian Federation. Also, Andrei Klepich, the chief economist and deputy chairman of Web.rf, public corporations. Natalia Orlova, head of Alpha Bank's Center of Macroeconomics Analysis, and also Alexey, the chief economist of Uralsib Capital. And so we also have some front row experts: Oleg Vyugin, chairman of the supervisory board of Moscow Stock Exchange; also Dmitry Belousov, deputy chief director of the Center of Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Presentations; and also Natalia Akindinova, head of Development Center of the High School of Economics. Okay. So, Alexey, the floor is yours. So if we would talk about the key risks for social and economic development of Russia in the midterms, and logically it's 2020 to 2023, so we have some scenarios. Scenario number one is a special target scenario based on the presidential decree 204, which declare that we have some special target levels to be achieved. So the first scenario was developed by the Ministry of Economic Development after his speech in the Federal Assembly in 2005. At that point of time, so this scenario was about development to rents by 2016-2019. So it was about sustainable development, substantial improvement of business climate, privatization, and improvements, some improvement. And the priority was with the private initiatives. Moreover, the mid-term economic development indicators were much higher. And I would like to remind you that the growth of labor productivity was 5% a year on average, and GDP growth exceeding the world average growth. So, but our mid-term scenario from the Ministry of Economic Development was transformed. So now the key role is that of the state. So the state accumulates resources both due to increasing taxes and by attracting funds at financial markets. So the funds achieved from external sources is about 1.5 trillion rubles. So financially, the forecast for the year is quite poor. So the forecast from the pessimistic scenario from the Ministry of Economic Development was about 1%, but the most probabilistic scenario forecasts 1.3%. So the investment project should be implemented at the cost of the state, and by 2021 we expect a growth in investment activity in the private sector with the subsequent growth of the GDP above 3% after 2021. So this is the base scenario, which is what the Ministry of Economic Development pursues, and in our opinion it entails certain risks. And I would like to leave the target indicators alone, but I would like to rather focus on risks. So number one is that the role of the state is the leading one. According to the Ministry of Economic Development and its classification, so the main sources of capital investment is the state with about 12%, 15% are state monopolies and about 70% are private investments. And whether we are going to reach the multiplying effect by stimulating the entire economy and the private sector by this share of 15%, so it's a big question. And of course, there are high risks that due to the growth of interest rates and higher tax load, and due to insufficient improvement of investment climate, so the internal investment will stay at the current level of 2 to 3%, and the share of capital investment in GDP is not likely to reach 25%, but will stay at the level of 18 to 22%, and that's the main risk. So secondly, the second risk is that the real threat is the new growth of the labor costs. From 2002, we were witnessing the acceleration of salary growth. They were ahead of the labor costs. So that was in case in 2012 to 2014, and in 2015 we saw an adjustment effect when salaries went down by 10% and the efficiency of economy grew. So also last year the labor productivity became 1.9% higher, and salary grew by 3.8%. And in 2018, so the growth was 7.9% as opposed to 1.5% in labor efficiency growth. So again, we are back to the trend of a low economy efficiency, and the trend is ongoing. So, and I used the forecast of the Ministry of Economic Development prepared till 2024. By 2021, the situation is expected to grow better, and we expect a growth of labor efficiency which would likely to exceed salary growth. But if we would look into the historical data and graphs, the situation is likely to be different. So we should await a correction of salaries, like what happened back in 2009, which didn't lead to a GDP growth at the time. So GDP growth rate and oil prices. Another difference from the target scenario we had in 2016 from the current one was that the older scenario included the current oil price of $45 per barrel, so it envisaged an upward scenario. But the current scenario rather predicts a downward trend in the oil prices. In recent 2 years, we were told that the economy is less dependent on the oil prices. But on that, I would like to comment that when oil prices grow by 32%, our economy grows by just 1.5%. And we have a weaker link between oil prices and our economy. But my concern is that the opposite rule is true, and it would not be quite correct to expect higher economic growth when oil prices would be going down. So with lower oil prices, we will have shrinking economy and lower budgets. So stagnation is likely to be one of the main factors.
A new corridor for the exchange rate of the ruble. This is a forecast from the Ministry of Economy. average yearly rate price for oil and average exchange rate for ruble. Just according to statistics, we can see that when the ruble is stronger, economy grew by 7%, and now it's the growth is by less than 1 percentage point. And this idea that the weak ruble helps economy to grow, this is a false assumption. When we do the economic analysis, even taking into account the structure of the Russian import, when 30% of import, that's investment goods, and 40% they are interim consumption goods. 70% of imports participates in the exchange activities, and this weak ruble has a negative effect on the economy. So, for example, after devaluation in August in 2018, the investment input fell by 10%. The link is very clear, and the influence happens very quickly. When we think about possible scenarios, we have a question. With this budget rule, what will happen with the ruble when the oil price drops? Is it possible that it will be stable? We saw the reverse situation when the ruble was devaluating. 31% of the growth of the average oil price as compared to 2017, and at the same time devaluation of ruble. Devaluation. Here we see the price per barrel of euros in rubles. You see it on the slide. That's historical maximum, and the price in ruble is significantly above the price we had when the price for oil was $130 per barrel. So for the oil companies, it could be a boon, and that would be great for the economy. But actually, this is just curbing of the economic growth, and unfortunately, this trend will continue. Yesterday, we talked about the development of the financial sector, and we discussed all the negative trends we have in the financial sector. So first of all, lack of stability of the banking system. That's the first precondition. Yeah, there is such phenomenon as the cleansing of the banking sector, but we don't know what's going to happen with the banking sector in the future. Will we have only the state-run banks, or are we going to have mixed ownership? Will we have just 10 banks, 2 banks in the future, or 10 banks will remain on the market? We still have risks because we have this uncertainty. There are some lending risks, deposit risks, and another risk, additional one, and it's something acknowledged by the central bank, by bloggers as well. That's the too high level of the number of loans granted to the population. And the macroeconomic risk here is the following. When deposit rates and mortgage rates are significantly above the real income of the population, every month we are going to see the deterioration in the structure of income and expenses of the population, and households have a higher tax burden every month. It grows every month. In America, 14%, that's at overall level of loans, or in Russia, and in US, it's about 85%. But the debt burden in Russia and in the US is more or less the same. So now we have very short-term debt, and it's very, very expensive. And unfortunately, this works as a snowball, and we shouldn't think that this small share of toxic debts, it's not a big problem, but it is a big problem, because when debts, the debts can grow, can become toxic very quickly, and the majority of households won't be able to pay the debt out. Another graph on the slide, it shows that the growth of bank loans is much above the available income of the population. And according to the past, and in the past years, we now see the record level of the statistics. Another thing, something which is discussed widely abroad. So by 2020, we are going to see the reduction in the economic activity cycle. The global economy its position will weaken. That's an additional risk. From 2020 to 2024, we hope to see the growth of up than 3% annually. In our view, realization of even some of these risks will be a barrier for achieving the target, our targets, and this is a big problem. The softer scenarios from the from the Ministry of Economic Development, this will be something like the soft landing, similar to the Chinese economy. And we don't think that these risks are really have very high probabilities. They're not among top 10 risks for the target scenario. Additionally, we need to say there is another scenario, inertia scenario, or a conservative scenario, according to which we will see GDP of 1.5% to 2% growth of GDP, and possibly there will be some violations, some fluctuations, but this will be stagnation, and disproportion will still be there. There will be still the focus on the raw materials in the economy. This is a conservative scenario. We are still optimists. That's the first thing. And the second thing, we think that the target scenario, according to which we need to stimulate private investments as much as possible. So this scenario is still quite probable to be implemented, and we hope this is much more stable one that's better than domineering of the state and the economy. Alexey, thank you very much. And now I'd like to ask all the members of the discussion some of the questions. We could talk about some other risks related to the development of the Russian economy. Of course, we don't want to impose our point of view. There are different possible views and scenarios. So I have some questions which are rather diverse. And when you answer your questions, you can, of course, make some comments about the report of Alexey. That you will be very welcome to do that. The only request to you is to speak for not more than 5 minutes, so that we stay on the schedule, so that we can discuss all the matters in front of us. We are going from the top down, from the top level to the bottom. So we are talking about the global economy, and maybe building on the previous session, we had a representative of the World Bank. Now we have the representative of the International Monetary Fund with us. And the last major report, forecast of the global economy and the economy of Russia, this report of the International Monetary Fund issued in October is quite positive. So there are some forecasts about the development of the Russian economy in 2019. They actually look more favorable than the target forecast of the Ministry of Economic Development of Russia. So the report of the World Bank is less positive. It was issued not so early. The question to you, was there some changes in the trend in the global economy? Can we expect that the International Monetary Fund will readjust the forecast? Or you still think that the situation is much better than what the Russian minister thinks?
For the invitation, for the question, and for a great presentation. Indeed, we are going to change the forecast. The way the IMF works in terms of its forecast is produces 4, one in April and one in October, together with the spring meetings and annual meetings. The one that Moderator was referring to was a growth rate for 2019 of 1.7%. That was our forecast for 2019 in the October World Economic Outlook. And then we produce two other forecasts, the updates, one in January, so that one is coming next week. Unfortunately, I cannot tell publicly right now because we're still in the middle of doing that, but this forecast is going to be available shortly, and another one in July. So let me just put in bit just give you, if you want, the context in which we produce our forecast and the explanation of that forecast in October, and also some clues about where we see our new forecast coming. So the first thing I would say is that growth in 2017 and 2018 had a very large cyclical component. So Russia went into recession in 2015 and 16. This opened the gap. And so what the growth that we see in the Russian economy, both in 17 and 18, was mainly cyclical. But that period is basically done with. The output gap, Russia enters 2019 with a situation in which all cyclical indicators point to an output gap that is already closed. The labor market is very near full employment. The inflation rate is very near the target. And so from 2019 onwards, and barring shocks, what we should expect is the Russian economy to be growing very near its potential growth rate. And we assess this potential growth rate at around 1.5% per year. At the moment, we put together this rather positive forecast for 2019. We built on this long-term potential of the economy of 1.5%, and to that, we added the discussion that was held more or less at the middle of the year, June, July, where was this discussion about the development fund that was going to be implemented and the extra spending that was going to happen in the budget to push growth. So this 1.7, 1.8% that we're expecting for next year was the 1.5 that is potential, plus some push on demand that was coming from the fiscal. Now, in the last few months, things have begun to change a bit. That doesn't mean that we are going to change our narrative. Our narrative continues to be the same. Macroeconomic policies in Russia are very good. The economy is very resilient to shocks. But I mean, the factors that explain long-term growth are still there, and the economy continues, in our view, to have a long-term potential of 1.5%. The fiscal impulse is going to be there, but the latest information suggests that this is going to be impacting more the economy in the second half of the year, not in the first half of the year. So then, most likely, we are going to moderate our projection for next year. And at the same time, there are other factors that are if you want, adding to the forecast that mainly come from a world economy that has, if you want, the momentum in the world economy is a little bit softer right now, and also there is clearly tightening in global financial markets that also can contribute to a somewhat softer growth in 2019. But overall, we don't expect a huge revision of our forecast, and we expect the growth in 2019 to be near potential.
Thank you. И продолжая, наверное, еще вот.
Thank you very much. And building on the matters related to outside risks and matters, I have a question to Dmitry Belousov. So this is a question. One of the targets of the development is the following: the expansion of the import potential, the doubling of this potential. Usually, when we discuss this topic, we talk about some Russian companies proposing competitive goods which could compete on the global markets. But on the other hand, in my view, this growth of supply in the international market is too optimistic, and without the expansion of the demand, I don't think that looks realistic. We today discussed already this phenomenon that the global economy is not going to slow down significantly in the nearest years, but we don't think we'll have the same growth rates as in the years 20 years ago, when the demand was expanding significantly. So we still have a lot of trade wars, protectionism phenomenon, and possibly sanctions will be tightened. Not everything depends on our policy, not everything depends on us. But still the question to you, do you think that these limits and barriers of the demand are they important for reaching this target? And if you think that this target is admissible, do you think that what kind of sectors have the most potential for expanding Russian goods on the international market? 2 years ago, we had some forecast about that, but the situation was radically different. I think that the situation is not as optimistic as colleagues do. We have an international forecast, the accelerating risk indicator. This is now above 0. Unfortunately, we're not yet in the zone of the middle crisis risks, but we are in the lower range of risks, and this indicator started to grow. It's not 0 anymore, and I can't assure you that in 1 or 2 years, 2 or 3 years, we are not going to have another corrective recession. And this position is similar to position of my colleagues. We've been to the Link conference in Santiago, and the majority of colleagues agree with me. So we think what will happen if we have the crisis in such economies as Argentina, Turkey, and some similar countries in the backdrop of the trade wars. So there are some overheated, highly technological markets. So with all this in mind, we possibly will have to see the synchronization. Export. We have 4 groups of products and services that we can export. Hydrocarbons. That would be good if we maintain the existing turnovers, as we are in the OPEC plus and this gas quotas. We have problems with the Northern Stream. We have problems with Ukraine. So here we have significant problems. We here have very tense situation, and Chinese market and other Southern European markets, they are also very difficult for us. Sector group of products, IT, services and products. Here the potential is very high, but we have the potential of the growth and creation of new companies. Next group of products, transport. Here we need to compete with some seafaring, sea logistics. Here we need to compete significantly, and we would be happy if we win. Next group of products. Raw materials, metals, chemicals, processing industries. So here we have 2 different types of scenarios. First of all, investment demand from foreign countries, but they are just the final link in the trade wars. The main trade war is between America and China, but obviously weaker links of this chain received a blow. So China reduces purchasing from Africa and other third world countries. So our metallurgy products can also receive a hit. We have the potential for growth, but it's limited. Machines and equipment, that's also an interesting group of products. Grain, pharma can also be added here. So with grain, we have saturation, more or less, southern markets here. The main expansion, that's the machines market. But this market is growing rapidly. These markets grow fast. We can launch our products there, but we have a problem with sanctions. We have a problem with demand, and we have the problem with our systemic support and financial policy. We can't really ensure a similar scale of the financial support like our competitors, and we can't ensure the development product domestically. As a structuralist, I think that we are in this trap, and our main income we receive from the commodities market, and here we are in the 1 to 2% ghetto. It's really very detrimental for the economy, or the economy is not efficient. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's now rather focus on our internal development factors, and then to problems which are within our control, within our economic policy, and which can be influenced by solutions made by Russian stakeholders. And I would like to begin with the key driver, at least as the government suggests for the economic development in the next 2 years, like implementation of national economic projects and seeing how they can influence the dynamics of our GDP. I would like to ask this question to a number of people, because thus we can collect several opinions. So, what's the degree of influence of national projects on the national economy's growth? Andrei, let's begin with you. Thank you. I would like to begin by saying that we have a consensus in our government that the main driver is not the national projects and not the measures of government stimulation, but the potential measures taken by the private business, because we see the export of capital and a substantial growth of accounts receivable by the companies that allows us to invest in a higher, at a higher extent than is possible. So yes, it's about 2 to 3 trillion rubles. So the investment on the side of the government was not enough, but it's a comprehensive topic we should discuss. Going back to national projects, so this topic was raised at our panel 1, and I really believe that national projects can be a big driver of Russian economy's growth, and to resolve some local problems, but there is a question whether they may lead to a breakthrough in the economy. And our analysis indicates that at a scale they are planned, although we will plan to adjust our forecast. So we should not expect a breakthrough and a GDP growth of 3%. Well, of course, we have some measures related to demographics and education, which will have a long-term influence. I don't think it's realistic to reach a life expectancy of 78 years by 2024, but some measures having to do with combat of diseases like cancer and development of the first hour medicine, so they are important targeted measures. But if we would take parameters, and as mentioned by Alexey, so if we have higher funding in the healthcare sector, so we can anticipate no breakthrough in this financial area. So in 2013, so our expenses on the healthcare was about 4%. And for 2018, it is just 3.1% together with the mandatory healthcare insurance. So with the national projects, we can only reach 3.3, 3.4%. So we are not getting to the level of 2012, despite the salary growth in the healthcare center. And as for the foundation for the technological and innovation area, there is a lack of resources. And also in the education. So statistics is better, but if we would take a budget, the peak was 4 to 4.5%. Now we are back to 3.5%. So by the end of the year, we can get to a slight growth up to 3.6%. But that's not a breakthrough. Internationally, we are behind industrialized countries and some developing countries like India. So there is a question on whether we need equipment for universities and how many world-class universities we should have. So in the morning, we remembered the presidential decree from 2012 and a package of laws on development of education and science, but they were not completely vested into life regarding raising our universities to the level of the top-class universities in terms of residential facilities infrastructure. It's better with the secondary schools, but 10 years ago we were at the same level of China of 1.1%, but at the moment China reached the level of 2%, and by purchasing power, Chinese budget is 5 to 6 times higher, and we are still at the same level of 1.9. So that's an indication of a stagnation. So national projects allow us to resolve some questions with the experimental scientific base and creating competency centers. But as a matter of fact, our estimates allow us to anticipate a growth of 1.2% of GDP. So we are in a situation of lagging behind, and this gap is not likely to be breached, even despite all our expectations on private investment in science and the environment, as we see. And we have big problems, as our Minister of Construction and Housing said, that at the current dynamics of 80 plus million, it's not possible to reach the level of 120 million of square meters. So we don't only need extra funding, but also rethinking of the package of measures we have. So everyone keeps saying that our priorities are like plans for developing high-speed infrastructure, but we have only targeted solutions like high-speed highway Moscow to Kazan and express train tracks and bypasses around some big cities. But if you remember, back in the days we had a decision of the president to double the length of our motor roads. And we have national projects on the roads which also provide for a higher quality of maintenance, but there is no stress on even federal highways, let alone regional roads. And the length is 0.5 million kilometers. And our old priorities in the government's strategy were not met, so we left them behind. And they were 40% fulfilled. So the breakthrough in the process is what we need, and there would be a slight improvement. But if we would look into high-speed growth of public investment, so investment is decreasing in percentage of GDP. So if we would look Gazprom and Rosneft, which look like public investment, but they are 30% less as compared to 2014, before the shocking and sanctions-related effects. And we are actually repaying our social debts, so our salaries are likely to grow 7% this year, and they grew 3% this year, but before they fell by 13%. So we have a lot of risks, and along with economic risks, you need to understand that our social risks are substantial. And this is, yes, it is a serious step forward, so which identified our painful points, but the government has a lot to do to agree on the rules of funding, to reconcile them with the region. So we expect to feel the effect from the end of 2019 and 2020. So yes, so the growth rate might be 1.8% from 2020 and 2.5% later on, if we avoid oil price growth and other negative effects. Yes, so our resource for flex, our surplus is 80 billion to slightly above 1 trillion. So we have the national well-being fund. So we should probably have a budget with a slight deficit, and the potential estimates of GDP from 1 to 1.5%, and there is a possibility to accelerate up to 3% of GDP and above, and on average, due to our internal domestic demand, we can accelerate the growth rate, and we can also grow the GDP, which depends on the growth rate. And our real incomes dropped by 4%, and investment rate in 2015-2016 went down by 13%. So in recent 3 to 4 years, we need to compensate for that effect. So we have some opportunities for the breakthrough, but we need to think what we can do to use our potential in the short and medium term. Thank you. Thank you, Andrei. I understood that implementing our national project is not taking us to the point where we are getting a breakthrough. Natalia, your opinion, please. Over to you. Could you please give Natalia a microphone? In my opinion, this estimate of how national and public projects can influence economic growth, as a matter of fact, is a challenge for an analyst, for an expert. On the one hand, we see that these development trends, as set by the government, development in this area has a multifaceted effect on the economic growth, which is proved by theoretical and practical research by foreign and domestic experts. However, we can find an adequate approach for evaluation, and we need to distinguish between different type of effects. Short-term effects of national projects, which are first of all related with the influence on demand and the economy. And in our opinion, if we would take this influence of national projects in the short and mid-term, the effect is likely to be neutral. The point is that national projects, although they increase public budget expenses, they are funded by higher tax loads or for cutting other types of costs. And the very change in the cost structure from less productive to higher productive is not enough to change the structure of this multiplying effect of the budgetary costs. So, in the short term, we would evaluate this effect as a very low, close to a zero effect. And if the government would take a decision closer to what the Center of Strategic Developments offered, funding a national project by using more revenues from oil and gas, by mitigating these budgetary rules. So this short-term effect on the budget could be positive. Otherwise, when we evaluate so this influence on the economic development, so we should account more for the long-term effects, which can reveal closer to 2024 or the longer run. In this context, every national project entails a big number of measures that influence growth factors in the long run. All national projects related to demographics and human capital will influence labor offer and quality in the national economy, and also projects in healthcare and education. They have an investment-based component like infrastructure development, which will have effect for capital accumulation and the aggregate effect just for increasing production capacities. In the long run, these projects are related to the range and quality of programs. So, and the quality of the national programs is evaluated by experts not as close to 100%, but rather ranging from 40 to 80% in the best case. In terms of whether funding is likely to be enough and whether measures are likely to be efficient. So, at the moment we can tell you that these effects required to reach our targets we need to support our economic growth will not be the highest possible. And from that point of view, if you remember what was told in the morning session, the very structure of the national project is subject to change. If you would monitor them and analyze their effects, this is something, well, what is planned at the moment is not the last word. And so that gives us a reason for being optimistic. But if we would talk about reaching the economic growth level above 3%, then I would agree with the previous speakers that without more investments into private sector, you are not getting any acceleration. So from that point of view, of course, it's a question on whether you can mitigate the regulatory load, but we need to repeat that also the load from the law enforcement bodies on the business remains high, and there is so the risk for running a business in Russia remains high, as commented by Russian and foreign experts. And in my opinion, resolving this question is the top priority if we would like to raise more investments. And also, we have certain structural constraints in our economy, and historically the accumulation rate was never close to 25%, and to reach that targeted scenario we need big shifts in the dynamics of aggregate productive dynamics, and that has to do with the relations between the public sector, the big corporation business with a higher level of monopolies and low officially, as commonly recognized. And at the moment, the government's plan for national projects and also the plan for increasing savings ratio, it provides also for a plan of improving labor efficiency. So it means influence on these larger corporations, but what's being discussed now is retaining this structure.
And we do not quite understand how, with all that being said, how can we see the increase in the private business significantly? According to scenario, we see that the expected growth of efficiency for the large businesses is higher than on average for the economy. Then it's not clear how the growth of the small businesses can grow if just arithmetically the efficiency of the small businesses is not going to grow equally fast. In our viewpoint, the potential of small businesses in achieving the national goals within the national projects is not clearly stated. Besides, there are a lot of measures in the background being implemented that curb the activity of the private sector. So, for example, there is this high-scale attack on the shadow economy, shadow salaries, gray salaries paid under the table. So we see inconsistency of the policy, and I don't see very clear understanding of the priority for the development of small and medium businesses. Summing up, I'd like to ask the question about the implementation of the national projects. Some of the projects are funded, it's proposed they will be funded from the budget. That's why I'd like to ask Alek Vyugin, what do you think about the fiscal policy, the fiscal rule that we have right now? So this rule was a defining principle for defining the sources of financing for the national projects. Increasing of the VAT tariff. This what was done. Besides, this budget fiscal rule influences the economy because it also concerns the monetary policy. To answer this question, I think I need to give you the overall assessment of the situation. How can I call this model, this economic model which we opted for? I think this is a defensive model or defensive strategy that we opted for in Russia. First of all, that's accumulation of reserves, and it's done quite intensively. Second thing, preventive increase of taxes and just the search of additional possible sources of income for the budget. Third, significant surplus of the budget, although we need to stimulate economic growth actively. Next, support of the weak ruble and high interest rates. And I'll explain you what are the consequences of that. Focus on national projects and an attempt to force small companies to participate in the national projects. Is this model efficient or not? I think the efficiency is zero. First of all, excessive accumulation of reserves, that's the failure to use resources for stimulating the economy. Increase of taxes, that's of course the burden on the commercial activity and also reducing the demand from the population. Weak ruble, this is a very interesting phenomenon. Together with the sanctions which physically constrain the technologies, as a result, we have a high negative margin for the technological modernization. The accessibility of technologies become more expensive, and also there is a physical restraint because of the sanctions. State investment priority, as it was said, we have the low efficiency for the use of resources. So I've tried to describe the model we used, and I've described the consequences. That's why I think everyone on this panel used a lot of figures about the potential economic growth, and these figures do not showcase any type of any hint of a breakthrough. Budget rule. Budget rule, it's over-conservative. That's my point of view. Yes, we do need to have a budget rule because we need to somehow work with the high volatility of the oil prices, but I think we should have this. We shouldn't have this rule in such a strict form as we do now. Budget rule, the way it is formulated now, that's the part of the model, defensive model of the economic development. Unfortunately, this was a rather logical solution, and it's a consequences of some foreign of outstanding consequences. And that's the position of the Russia in the global economy. That's how the things are. But this defensive strategy, I think, is overly defensive. And we should have used a slightly different model. That's my opinion. Thank you very much. We spoke about the long-term growth rates of the economy and this forecast, which was published by Alpha Bank. We saw their rather low forecast of the mid-term growth rates of the Russian economy. Potential growth rates. Okay, thank you. I have a question to Natalia Orlova. From Alpha Bank. Do you mean that the most probable scenario is the model most close to the European model, stagnation, the model with very low growth rates in the long term? Now, this is the model which we see in the EU or Japan. So there are some serious structural measures. They do not influence the growth rates a lot. Thank you very much. I think this is a status quo model. And I think that this model, that's what we actually see in reality. We did this report at the end of the year, potential growth rates for Russia. We make adjustments once in 2 years. The first assessment was done in 2013. We had 1.5% to 2% in 2015. We had 0.5 to 1% forecast, and in this forecast we use different models, usually as the manufacturing function, but we used data from 2017 and we had 0.7% potential growth rates. Not the actual forecast, but the potential growth rates. We used additional models for making sure that this assessment is very accurate. Because right now, official assessment from the central bank is 1.5 to 2%. 0.7, that's much less, but we used the real interest rate, and together with the potential growth rate, we have 1.1, 1.3 growth rates. I never could get a result of 1.5 using various methods for my calculations. Unfortunately, we didn't base on a specific, one specific model growth rate, but we are in a trap, and that's how it is. I'd like to comment on the efficiency of national projects. I think that national projects, I do agree that this is a big step forward as compared to the program we had in 2012, because right now the reaction is more adequate. But I think investment in healthcare and education, that's something which will not show quick wins. And I think maybe that's better to focus on the long-term results. So if we greedily want to get quick results in the form of the growth rates up to 3%, that's the wrong approach. Now, we do not want to see really very quick effects, because this will be detrimental for the long-term results. I think that we need to think for the long term, and we need to understand what will happen with our competitiveness, for example, for the longer period. As for our model and situation in the economy, I think that unfortunately my assessments and assessments of Gabriel, 1.5% forecast, not very high statistics. It's like an expectation trap, or the crisis of expectations. When we try to forecast the behavior of the private sector, private investments, we need to understand that for this sector, forecasting is difficult because we have short-term forecasting, 2024. That's a very short horizon. And longer horizons are much more difficult to forecast because of some external risks. And because for many, many years, actual growth rates are below the forecasted. We did compare the forecast with real figures, and we saw that actual growth rates are permanently below the forecast. Although we have a stable, positive view outlook, but unfortunately it doesn't come true. Of course, it would be better to have the actual data, to have a look at the reality and understand the status quo. One small clarification. Do you think that national projects shouldn't bring short-term growth rates? Every year I create forecast for businesses, so I feel much more comfortable with the 0.n% forecast, and 2 or 3%, that's not something I feel comfortable with. Possibly the growth rate will be higher, but as for the national projects, I think that we didn't reach the ceiling with personal loans, and I think a lot of banks are interested to provide more loans. Sanction risks are more significant in the corporate lending, and there are additional constraints in the corporate lending sector. So possibly we'll have 1.5% or even more on the backdrop of the additional lending to physical persons. But from the point of view of a person who regularly creates forecasts, I would say that conservative forecast is something more realistic. Another question about the potential of the economic growth and investment activity. That's a question about the development of the financial sector. We had a separate session about that, and I still think we need to talk about that today too. There is an opinion that right now we've seen the end of the cleansing of the banking system, as Alexey called it. The financial sector doesn't have any potential for major turmoil, major bombshells. We do not have something similar to Открытие Bank or Bin Bank failures. And the banking sector is now, at least structurally, is ready to start the new stage of the development and support of the development of Russian economy. I have a question to Alexey, who represents a banking sector. What do you think about the situation in the banking sector? Briefly, I would say that the situation is relatively stable. But we need to understand that if we are talking about the health of the financial sector, a lot depends on the external circumstances, and we have a lot of risks. For example, some of them were mentioned by my colleagues, but in general, I think we underestimate potential risks. We need to stress the importance of China. Soft landing of the Chinese economy was mentioned today, and I think that this landing is not going to be soft. And there are two problems. First of all, we do not have very clear understanding of the Chinese economy. Statistics that we have is not always reliable. There is this proverb: there is big lie, there is statistics, and there is also Chinese statistics, which is a different thing. So we have some official statistics, And according to that, growth rates in China are underestimated. The latest data for foreign trade was not very optimistic, and the reaction was quite sensitive to that. Tax burden is unprecedentedly high. For the end of 2017, it's 258% of GDP for developing countries. That's really exorbitant. And we have information we have from some sources leaked from Chinese analytical centers. And according to them, bad debts are much higher. The share of assets related to real estate, which is fraught with problems, is also much higher. And as a result, we see higher risks of the potential of the significant financial crisis in China. China consumes a lot of commodities, and for us, it will be it can have deplorable consequences for Russia as well. Trade wars. That's also a very serious matter. Of course, the main trade war is raging between China and the US. And as we know, in the beginning of the year, we saw the beginning of negotiations, which are progressing fairly well. The second round of negotiations will happen in the end of January, if shutdown is not a problem for continuation. But the consensus opinion is that China will give in to request of the US and they will reach an agreement. It looks like a positive piece of news, but this agreement envisages the increase of import of fuel commodities. For example, liquefied gas from the US to China. They will increase the import of agricultural goods to China, and this will be a blow to Russian exports. Yes, we need to understand that we export a lot to China. If I'm not mistaken, first half year of last year, it's about 12% of all the exported goods. This will be a significant blow to a Russian export structure, and the colleagues talked about it at length. We also see rather pessimistic data on the economic situation in Europe, and I think that not later than next year we are going to see the significant slowdown of the global economy. The US, here the situation looks rather positive, but the slowdown of the global economy and the gradual tightening of the monetary policy in the US, reduction of the positive effects from the Trump tax reform, all of these factors will lead to the situation when the American economy starts slowing down faster than expected. We have significant external risks for the economy and for the financial markets in Russia as well, because the financial markets are much more sensitive to external shocks. Thank you. Our time is running up. Our session was devoted to the forecast of the Russian economy, so we should mention some figures. And my last question to every speaker will be the following. Could you please briefly share your forecast for 2019? What do you think will be the figure of the real GDP growth in Russia at the end of 2019. So the key parameter is, of course, oil prices. You can also forecast the average oil prices for 2019. Alexey, you're the first. I have rather pessimistic forecast. In 2018, I didn't see any single reason for 2019 to become an adaptive year. There is an arithmetical problem. In 2018, the growth was 1.5%. In 2019, 1.3%. And 2020, it's going to be 2%. And this means that the first half year of 2019 is going to be negative. The probability is rather high. And that's one of the major psychological projects. Are we going to jump up from the zero? I think 0.8, 0.9 with oil price, difficult to say, $50 to $60 per barrel. That's my forecast. Gabriel?
Promise I'm going to use 2 minutes. I told you already that the IMF new forecasts are going to be available probably next week. Very briefly, I don't expect it to be very far from the 1.5% that we have in the long term, but just look for it. But I'm going to say 1 more minute, if you allow me, since I didn't speak. Since I didn't speak too much in my first intervention, talk about the fiscal rule. Fiscal rule needs to do 2 things. The first thing that it needs to do is to set up guess more or less what is the long-term oil price. If you guess wrong the long-term oil price, then your domestic prices get misaligned. And if the domestic prices get misaligned, this gives completely wrong signals about what is worth producing, either things that you can export or things that you cannot export. The first thing. Second thing that the fiscal rule needs to do is to avoid that fluctuations in the oil market get translated into fluctuations in aggregate demand, because this creates a mess in domestic prices. When you have oil prices that are high, basically what you have is a very strong ruble, and all the incentives in the economy are for investing in non-exportable goods. And when oil prices are low, converse happens, the weaker ruble, you have a high price of tradables, and then exportables become more profitable. But if you are in a roller coaster, of course, the signals that you are giving to investors and to the private sector are wrong. So basically, again, 2 things. You have to guess more or less what's the long-term oil price. You have to stick to it. And the second thing that you have to do is avoid that fluctuations in oil prices go into domestic economy. This is what this fiscal rule is doing. One thing that did not appear in the news, and I think is worthy of news, is that oil prices went down from more or less 70, almost $80 per barrel to almost 50 at the end of December. This is a huge decrease in oil prices. The ruble didn't even move. And so this is the kind of basically stability in relative prices that in the very long term is good for business. If you don't have the stability, then planning investment and diversification, that as far as I know is a very, very important objective for Russian economy, to diversify exports, it's very difficult to achieve. One more thing, and I end. If you look at the 2012 strategy for growth, one thing that was there in the background, if you see, is the oil price. What do you think it was the forecast oil price in the 2012 strategy for growth for 2020? I'm just guess it. It was around $100. So basically, the whole 2012 strategy was based on an oil price that didn't materialize. So planning on oil prices that not materialize is risky. And so this is, when you adopt a rule, you have to be very, very careful that the rule that you adopt, you can stick to it in the long term. The second thing that I want to remind, back in 2 years ago, just 2 years ago, oil prices in January were $26 per barrel. So then, it's very important that going forward, Russia keeps this macro framework because it's working and begins to concentrate on the things that Russia needs to actually lift that growth, the things that are bottlenecks to growth, like things like opening the economy, increasing competition, increasing efficiency, reducing the footprint of the state. These are things that Russia needs to concentrate going forward to lift up growth. Thanks.
And your forecast? Gabriel, your forecast?
It said already. I mean, the forecast for next year, actually for this year, we are going to have it ready next week. I mean, we are going to revise our forecast of October. It was a bit too high, as I said before. Most likely, it's not going to be very far away from the 1.5 that we have for the long term.
Андрей Николаевич.
Ну, у нас оценка на этот год 1,1 темп роста, причем ключевым тормозящим фактором будет все-таки...
So in our case, the forecast is 1.1%. The factor which will slow down will be a slow consumers growth, and the oil prices are likely to be $60 per barrel. And so if it goes down to 40 USD per barrel, then it would be marginal, like 0.5%. Natalia, my growth is 0.8 for GDP growth, and as for oil prices, $70 per barrel. Alexey. I would agree with Alpha Bank's forecast. In our case, it's 0.7%. The main factors are slowdown in world economy, Europe and China, first of all. And I would agree that the substantial growth would be lower consumers' demand due to an increase in inflation, also due to higher VAT and rate regulation, and the central bank's policy will be important because the Central Bank of Russia has to respond to all the shocks and risks, and it's no point to talk about the decrease of the key finance rate before the end of the year. So these are the factors which will cause the current situations in the economy. And for the Brent oil, our forecast is $68 per barrel. So, Natalia, Akindinova, 1% of growth at $60 per barrel. Before we heard 1.2 at $68 per barrel. So in our case, so $10 per barrel translates into 0.5% of GDP. And as for lower consumer growth, we will also see lower physical volumes of exports against the background of higher growth in 2017 and 2018, and that was the rebound in services. Dmitry Belousov, so 1.5% at 65 USD per dollars. So the dynamics of investment is low, and also we can face a series of shocks in construction industry related to a transition that's about the interest rates and higher VAT and escrow accounts in residential sectors with lower buildings. So, Oleg, so the demand for oil at a global scale will decrease. So my forecast for the oil prices is 6 USD per barrel and above. And if the GDP growth is likely to be 0.8%. Thank you. So the forecasts are not so optimistic. But let's have a discussion. Let's continue this discussion next year at our forum. Many thanks to all our participants and also to all the attendees of our session.